So we're going to talk about electrolytes. We're going to look at sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. The first one I want to talk about is sodium. So when we're looking at sodium, sodium is your primary electrolyte that's located outside the cell. Sodium, the range is 135 to 145, and that's measured in milliequivalents per liter. Now, if we go less than 135, we're going to call that hyponatremia. And so natremia just refers to, as you can see right here, sodium. If I go greater than 145, I'm going to call that hypernatremia. All right. So what happens if you have hyper or hyponatremia? If I were to, let's say, drink a whole bunch of water, there's a thing called water intoxication. And if I drink a whole lot of water, what I do is I start to hemodilute the sodium, and what happens is the osmolarity outside the cells becomes less than the osmolarity inside the cells. And so that free water that I'm drinking, what it's doing is this, is let's say that my osmolarity here, it started off at, let's say, 297 in here and 297 out here, but when I drank all this water, part of that 297 was the 140 milliequivalents of sodium, but I started to dilute that. What that does now is that takes water and it draws it into the cell. So now I'm pulling water into the cell, and what's happening is the cells are starting to swell, and they can swell so much that they rupture. And there's actually deaths reported almost a month, every so often, where people get water intoxication and they die because of the rupturing of the neurons. On the other hand, if I have hypernatremia, what takes place is if I become dehydrated and I concentrate the water out here, let's say that this goes to 325. Well, that would be considered, the reason that went to 325 is because the sodium went up, okay? And what that's going to do is that's going to pull water out of the cell. So whether I'm pulling water out of the cell or into the cell, what you're going to do is you're going to change the function of the cells. So this would be a neuron, this would be a muscle cell. These are both excitable cells. But sodium primarily, the thing that you see is a change in in the levels of consciousness. And so change in levels of consciousness can happen either because the cells are shrinking or the cells are swelling. Now that's what happens in neurons. Down here in muscle, what happens is muscle weakness because we're pulling water from the cell or adding water to the cell. The next thing I want to look at is potassium. So when you look at potassium, potassium is about 3.0 or 3.5 to 5.0, and that's also measured in milliequivalents per liter. Now, if I go less than 3.5, that's going to be considered hypo, and that would be kalemia. And of course, kalemia just refers to potassium. On the other hand, if I go greater than 5.0, that's going to be considered hyper, and that would be kalemia. Okay, so there's my, and I actually should have probably done it like that. Okay. So now I can have either hypo or hyperkalemia. Now, potassium is your primary ion that maintains resting membrane potential. And so we have these excitable cells. We have the axon of the neuron that's excitable. We have the sarcolemma of the muscle cell that's excitable. If I look at resting membrane potential is what is this at when you don't have action potentials being generated? Well, the resting membrane potential of, let's say, a neuron, let's say it's at negative 70 millivolts. Well, its threshold, usually to pop open these activation gates on these voltage-gated sodium channels, threshold is usually about 15 millivolts above that. So if this is at negative 70, this might be at negative 55. And what that means is that if I can push this to negative 55, these voltage-gated channels will pop open, and I can get sodium coming in, and I can replicate this action potential. All right, so let's say we have a patient, and they have hypokalemia. It could be someone that has something like Cushing's disease. Cushing's disease, what you see this potassium onboarding of sodium, but also wasting of potassium. And so what would be the effect of hypokalemia? Well, normally inside the cell, we've got about 135 milliequivalents per liter of potassium inside the cell. And outside the cell, it averages about 4.0. Well, now cells, they attract the negative charge, this negative 70 inside the cell actually attracts the positive charge of potassium. I've got leak channels for potassium, but potassium kind of likes it because the negative charge attracts the positive charge. However, because of its chemical gradient, potassium goes outside the cell. But look what happens. Potassium goes out of the cell on its chemical gradient, but when it goes outside, the negative gradient becomes greater and it usually draws potassium back in. So potassium goes out, comes back in, goes out, comes back in. If I do leave potassium outside the cell, I can sweep it back in using the sodium-potassium ATPase pumps. But let's look at what happens with hypokalemia. Let's say that this outside the cell goes to, let's say, 2.8, okay? Now my chemical gradient is increased for it to go outside the cell. So what's going to take place is potassium now is going to leave the cell along its chemical gradient. What that does is when it takes its positive charge with it, the net effect is that the inside of the cell is going to become more negative. So hypokalemia will actually hyperpolarize the cell because I don't have the retained positive charges. Now on the other hand, if I get something like hyperkalemia, let's say that I go to 5.6, okay, so I'm hyperkalemic. In this case, I've increased the concentration outside the cell, so not as much potassium leaves. So potassium is retained in the cell, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to push that towards threshold. So here's what you're going to see, is if I have hypokalemia, what's happening is my resting membrane potential is dropping away from threshold, and so you'll have hyporeflexia. So if I were to do test the interfusal fibers, if I were to hit your tendon with a rubber mallet, I would see a blunted response because of your hypokalemia. With hyperkalemia, on the other hand, I'm moving my resting membrane potential towards threshold, and then what happens is I see hyperreflexia, and so I see a greater response to that stimulus. But something interesting happens. Hyperkalemia, if it's severe enough, it'll actually reach threshold. And when it reaches threshold, then you've actually negated the opening and closing of these voltage-gated channels. And at that point, hyperkalemia also produces hyporeflexia. So you'll see an increase in irritability until you reach threshold, and then you muted the response on the tissues. Okay, so the next thing is calcium. So if I look at calcium, calcium is about 8.5 to 10.5, and it's measured in milligrams per deciliter. That's usually what it is in the body. But with calcium, it's kind of interesting because even though I'm measuring calcium at 8.5 to 10.5, what I'm doing is I'm measuring both bound and unbound calcium. So let's say that this is albumin. Well, 50% of my calcium is bound to albumin and 50% is ionized. So really, the 8.5 to 10.5 is my total calcium, including the ionized calcium and the membrane or the albumin-bound calcium. If I just look at the ionized calcium, it's about 4.5 to 5.5 milligrams per deciliter. Now, if I were to look at calcium, I can have hypocalcemia or hypercalcemia. So if I have hypercalcemia, I've got too much basically ionized calcium because it's physiologically available to do work. But because they consider total calcium, usually hypercalcemia, you've gone greater than 10.5 milligrams per deciliter on both your ionized and your total calcium and albumin bound. On the other hand, hypocalcemia, what I've done is I've dropped that below less than 8.5. So anyway, but it's only the ionized that can do the work. Now, here's what happens, is calcium, where potassium maintains resting membrane potential, calcium actually maintains your threshold. So these voltage-gated channels, I've got this voltage-gated channel right here, so there's a sodium voltage-gated channel. Calcium comes in, and what it does is it stabilizes this. So at normal calcium levels, this is stabilizing your threshold. So your threshold remains 15 millivolts above your resting membrane potential. But think about what happens. If I have hypercalcemia, I'm going to stabilize this too much, and threshold is going to move up further away from resting membrane potential. And so what you're going to get is you're going to get someone that has hyporeflexia. They don't respond, okay? On the other hand, if I have hypocalcemia, I lose the stabilization of this channel and threshold drops this way. So hypo drops your threshold towards your resting membrane potential. Hyper moves your threshold away from the resting membrane potential. So these are the patients you have to worry about, because with hyperkalemia, the patient tends to be pretty non-active because the threshold is away from resting membrane potential, and so there's muscle weakness, there's a flaccidity. However, if they're hypokalemic and threshold is moving towards resting membrane potential, there's danger there because they're having spasticity and fasciculations. And this spasticity can involve the airway, and so they can actually go into laryngeal pharyngeal spasm. And so you might want an intubation kit for your patient with the hypokalemia. Okay, so last one we're going to look at is just magnesium. So with magnesium, what it does is it's going to, the level's about 1.5 to 2.5 in serum, and so you can have hypermagnesemia or hypomagnesemia. But basically the function of magnesium is this, is when I look at these channels, this is a voltage-gated sodium channel on my axon. My voltage-gated sodium channels have to open up in order to open up my voltage-gated calcium channel. When calcium comes in, if this is, let's say this was the neuromuscular junction. When calcium comes in to this neuromuscular junction, what's going to take place is I'm going to release my neurotransmitter. So here I've got this neurotransmitter of acetylcholine. Okay? Now, when calcium comes in, I have what are called V-snare and T-snare proteins. So here's my V-snare. V-snare just stands for vesicular because this is a vesicle of acetylcholine. T-snare stands for terminal. And so what happens is when calcium comes in, these proteins will change their configuration and align so that they'll lock together. They'll basically, it's called kiss and run. They'll dock and then they'll spread apart so I can release my acetylcholine into this neuromuscular junction. Now, if you look at the charge on magnesium and the charge on calcium, if I have normal levels of magnesium, I'm going to release normal quantas of my neurotransmitter. However, if I have hypermagnesemia, what's going to happen is I'm going to have magnesium competing with calcium coming in. And so I have more magnesium coming in and less calcium coming in, so I don't dock my neurotransmitter and I'm releasing less ACH. On the other hand, if I have hypomagnesemia, I have less magnesium coming in, more calcium coming in, and what's happening is I'm releasing more neurotransmitter. Let me give you a clinical example of this. Let's say you have a lady and she's in the first part of her third trimester. Well, first part of the third trimester, what you don't want is you don't want uterine contraction. Because uterine contraction, it's too early. So let's say that this target cell right here, instead of being the neuromuscular junction, let's say that this target cell is the uterine wall. Well, in this case, what we have is we have over here, this would be smooth muscle at the uterine wall. We would have this M3 receptor. Okay, it just stands for muscarinic, and it's the type 3. So what would happen is the contraction is being mediated by the release of ACH plugging into this M3 receptor, activating a GQ protein, the PLC pathway, IP3DAG. I'm getting calcium in here, and I'm getting contraction. Well, I want to break that. I don't want them to continue to contract. So what you can do is you can actually give them magnesium. So if I give magnesium, it's considered a tocolytic agent. Toco is the tonus of the uterus, and then lytic is to break. So what you would do is you would give them magnesium, create hypermagnesemia. It's going to compete with calcium. You're going to release less ACH, and you're going to decrease the contractility. It's the same thing sometimes with cardiac patients. They'll have dysrhythmias, and so if you give them, it might be because their magnesium's low, but you give them magnesium and things start to slow down, settle down, because you're again competing with calcium for the release of the neurotransmitters. All right.